USS President Garfield was heading to China. On board, a middle-aged American stared out to sea. His passport said that he was a farmer, but he wasn't going to look at the land. He was going to look at the sky. His true task was to assess the condition of China's Air Force. His planned 3-month assignment turned into 8 years of warfare. By its end, he would be a major general, and the unit he created, the Flying Tigers, would be the most famous squadron in the history of aerial warfare. Chennault was born in 1893 in Commerce, Texas. His tough face revealed his character, bold, unyielding, and adventurous. But Chennault's spiky personality and disregard of military discipline often made him a thorn in his superiors' sides. Crucially, they did not recognize his brilliance as a tactician. That would come later. Chennault became obsessed with flying while at college. Of farming stock, he studied agriculture at college. But while his roots were on the ground, his heart was in the air. He served as ground crew during World War I and only entered a fighter pilot training program after the war. He advanced quickly, and in 1923, he became commander of the 19th Pursuit Squadron based in Hawaii. It was not a good time to be a fighter pilot. Military theorists claim that bombers were the future of aerial warfare.
It was believed by particularly the American Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force in particular that the major power of their future air forces should be bomber forces. They believed very strongly that future wars would be fought by fleets of heavy bombers, well armed, that could outpace defensive fighters. They believed that fast, big bombers would always get through.
The strategists thought that pursuit planes, known today as fighters, had no future in aerial combat. They said the bomber was the machine to win wars. However, Chennault was an ardent and a stubborn proponent of the fighter.
陈纳德他是在理论上，他认为说杜黑的轰炸机主义论根本就是错误的，因为杜黑认为说轰炸机只要一起飞之后，战斗机根本无法拦截，无法找到他们。那陈纳德对于这个思想他是否决的。
His radical views made him enemies in the high command. He would soon be put to the test. Chennault began to develop his new air battle theory and tactics while he was based in Hawaii. He concluded that formations of fighters were more effective than single planes. In addition to training fighter pilots, Chennault found time to pursue his passion. He organized and flew with an aerial acrobatic team, 3 men on the flying trapeze. In 1936, the aerobatic display team performed in Miami. Mao Bangchu, vice principal of China's Central Aviation School, was in the admiring crowd. After the show, Mao Bangchu invited Chennault to train pilots in China. Initially, Chennault declined. It took a personal letter from an unexpected source to change his mind. The letter came when he was at the low point of his career. His aerial warfare theory had been rejected by his superiors. They wanted him to retire on the grounds of ill health. Yet, he wanted to fly. An invitation from the wife of the President of China, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, offered him new hope. The Chinese government promised him the rank of colonel in the Chinese Air Force with a salary of $1,000 per month plus generous allowances. And most attractively, he was given the right to fly any airplane in the Chinese Air Force. At 4 times his former salary, it was an offer the grounded 44-year-old Chennault found impossible to refuse. A few days later, he began the most important journey of his career. Like many American military officers, Chennault believed that war between America and Japan was inevitable. But before war came, he wanted to see this enemy for himself. Together with his aerobatic teammate, Bill McDonald, he took a month-long tour of the country. With cameras hidden under their coats, they recorded potential military targets. Chennault realized that while his notes and photos were incomplete, they were nevertheless much better than all the intelligence in U.S. Army and Navy documents. Chennault arrived in Shanghai in June 1937. There he met his boss, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She was the wife of China's leader and, more importantly, the Secretary General of China's Aviation Committee. Madame Chiang called it "My Air Force," both in public and in private. It was more than a term of endearment. In 1936, her husband, China's leader Chiang Kai-shek, was almost killed by his own planes. Since that time, the Generalissimo and his wife maintained personal control of China's Air Force. But they needed Chennault to control China's skies. The blunt pilot from Texas and China's elegant First Lady made an odd couple, but they quickly discovered common ground. Chennault was captivated by the First Lady's elegance, her devotion to building an effective Air Force, and by her accent. Educated in Virginia, Madame Chiang spoke English with a beguiling Southern accent. Chennault was smitten. After their first meeting, the enchanted Texan proclaimed that he would never find inner peace and that thereafter she would be his princess.
因为蒋中正不懂英文，陈纳德不懂中文，那刚好有个宋美龄在中间，沟通起来就容易多了。而且宋美龄又是空军之母，在航空委员会里也有足够的地位。
Madame Chiang and Chennault were kindred spirits. They both believed that air power was crucial. Chennault began his inspection from Nanjing. Then he toured Air Force bases and aviation schools around the country. What he saw depressed him. Chennault discovered for himself just how corrupt and inefficient China's Air Force really was. Gradually, the true status of the Air Force became clear. It was not a pretty sight. In the 10 years since the foundation of the Chinese Air Force, factionalism, corruption, and nepotism had taken their toll. His officers told Chiang Kai-shek that there were 500 aircraft. Chennault's inspection revealed this to be a gross exaggeration. When Chennault reported that there were really just 90 operational aircraft, Chiang threatened to shoot the translator. Only Chennault's timely intervention saved his life. Meanwhile, Japan had 3,000 aircraft, 400 of which were based in Shanghai alone. In terms of quantity and quality, China's Air Force didn't stand a chance against its enemy. Chennault concluded that their inadequate training and obsolete aircraft made the Chinese pilots sitting ducks, ill-prepared for battle. The timing couldn't be worse. On July 7, 1937, before Chennault had even completed his report, gunfire at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing lit the spark that would consume China for 8 bitter years. 10 days later, Chiang Kai-shek made an important speech in front of Chinese and foreign journalists. He said, "China has been driven to the impasse. It is time to take action. The war had begun. Chiang's expression was determined, but he grabbed his hat and stood there, not knowing what to do with the catastrophe just around the corner. Chennault was on an inspection tour when war was declared. He immediately offered his services to China. He needed China as much as China needed him. Chennault needed an opportunity to test his theory of aerial warfare. China desperately needed him to recognize its Air Force. His 3-month tour as temporary advisor was over. An 8-year career as commander had begun. Chennault was the first foreigner to actively request to join the battle after the outbreak of the war with Japan. Chennault's first task was to complete his assessment of the war readiness of the Chinese Air Force.
他在抗战爆发初期呢，在庐山受蒋委员长召见的时候，他就讲过，空军虽然说有500架飞机在账目上，但其实只有91架可以做实际作战。那相反的话，日本人呢，陆军航空队的数量大概是1480架，海军的话是1220架。
Chiang was furious, but he respected Chennault's honesty. Chennault earned himself a reputation of being realistic and practical. What's more, he earned Chiang's trust. He was one of the few people who could speak the truth in front of Chiang at any time. Chiang Kai-shek kept faith in him throughout the entire war. It became the solid foundation for Chennault to stay in China and realize his ambition. Japan launched an all-out attack on Shanghai on August 13, 1937. China's coastal cities were bombed mercilessly. Bombers were the key to Japan's offensive. They believed there was no need to escort high-speed, heavily armed bombers with fighters. They could rampage in China's sky as they pleased. Except Chennault had a plan. Fighters, especially China's obsolete fighters, couldn't catch fast-moving bombers. But what if the defending fighters were already in the air, waiting for the enemy bombers to arrive? Chennault helped the Chinese create bamboo radar, an air attack early warning network. At the same time, he taught Chinese pilots how to use fighter formations against Japanese bombers. Vindication was immediate. In the next 3 bombing raids, 54 Japanese aircraft were shot down. On August 14th, the 4th Group of China's Air Force shot down 6 bombers without any loss. Thereafter, that date was known as China's Air Force Day. The star pilot, Liu Zhuigang, was good at putting Chennault's tactics into practice. In the first 2 days, he got 3 bombers. Chennault said Liu was his prize student. After all his years in the wilderness, Chennault had proved the value of his tactics. One Japanese battle report went so far as to conclude that Japanese bombers were no match for Chinese fighters. It was Chennault that made the Japanese realize what a big mistake they had made. As a reward, Madame Chiang gave Chennault a special gift. It was his own personal fighter, a Curtiss P-36 Hawk. She paid over $50,000 for it. Chennault flew it to observe air battles between China and Japan. He also investigated the activities of Japanese warships in the Yangtze River and troops along its banks. It was even rumored that Chennault used it to shoot down 30 Japanese planes. Of course, at that time, Chennault was in China as a non-combatant advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. Even if he did engage in combat with the Japanese, he could never admit it. No one knows for sure whether Chennault shot down Japanese fighters, but we do know the name of the first American airman to attack Japanese aircraft in China's skies. His name was Robert Short. Years before war was declared, he was an instructor for Boeing. In February 1932, he was demonstrating Boeing's latest fighter in Suzhou. When Japanese bombers attacked the city, he selflessly flew to its defense. He knocked one bomber out of action before being shot down by 3 Japanese fighters. The Chinese government posthumously made him a captain and raised a monument in his honor. With China and Japan officially at war, Chennault's actions drew Japanese attention. The Japanese government complained to Washington, demanding that Chennault and other U.S. instructors leave China.
Well, the Japanese hated him. Even as early as 1937, they actually had a $25,000 bounty on his head, which $25,000 in 1937 was a lot of money.
The U.S. government was reluctant to join foreign wars. Sanctions were in place to stop U.S. citizens involving themselves in foreign war. Americans in China were specifically prohibited from cooperating with the Chinese government in any military activities. Following their government's orders, some American trainers left China. Chennault didn't flinch. He would only leave when the last Japanese was driven from China. But he did lower his profile, at least for a while. After their big losses above the Yangtze River Delta, Japanese aircraft returned to Nanjing. And this time, they brought something new: advanced Mitsubishi Type 96 bombers and Nakajima Type 97 fighters to escort them. These planes were far superior to any in the Chinese arsenal. In the first day's battle, China lost 11 out of 16 aircraft. From then on, Japanese planes flew to Nanjing every day, shooting down more and more irreplaceable Chinese planes. Japan quickly seized control of the air over Nanjing, Shanghai, and most of the cities in eastern China. Chiang Kai-shek's first wife, Ma Fu-mei, was killed in the bombing. His second wife, Madame Chiang, appealed to the free world for aid in the defense of China.
Death comes from the clear blue sky, just as it has come to thousands of our innocent people throughout the length and breadth of our land. You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly.
But to China's dismay, the eruption of a full-scale war only made U.S. and U.K. neutrality laws bite harder. To avoid friction with Japan, they stopped selling military supplies to China. China could not replace planes lost in battle. By the end of October in 1937, there was nothing really left in the Air Force. The best pilots had been killed, and there were only 12 aircraft left. Without aircraft and pilots, Chennault could do nothing to help the Chinese Air Force to fight. While Chennault's hands were tied, help came from an unexpected quarter. Showing more than just moral sympathy, the Soviets provided financial and military support. The Soviet Union sent to China both planes and pilots to fly them. They were called the Soviet Volunteer Group. While China appealed to all nations to help against the Japanese aggressor, the Soviets were the first to provide material aid. Of course, the Soviets had their own agenda. Ideological differences between Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek were pushed aside. Following the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend, the Soviets provided vital men and equipment. The Soviets were badly in need of anyone who could weaken Japan and ease the Japanese imperialist threat to their own country. The Soviets were badly in need of anyone who could weaken Japan and ease the Japanese imperialist threat to their own country. They sent 4 fighter squadrons and 2 bomber squadrons of their most advanced planes, as well as over 2,000 pilots and crew.
他们全部穿便服的，只要飞行的时候穿飞行服，平常都是便服，不跟中国人接触的。因为中国国民党还是国民党嘛，他还是共产党嘛。
The first batch joined the battle to defend Nanjing. There was nothing Japan could do to stop them. Before long, the secret was out. The Soviet volunteer group was on everyone's lips. Japan was frightened because there was nothing they could do to stop the Soviet participation. From 1937 until 1941, the Soviet Union supplied China with over 1,200 aircraft and helped to train Chinese pilots. It was the most difficult time for China's Air Force. Without the equipment supplied by the Soviets, the Air Force would have collapsed. Despite the Soviets' insistence on their own way to fight, Chennault, as the advisor to China's Air Force, sometimes discussed battle plans with the Soviet commander and Chinese leaders. Chennault spoke highly of the Soviet volunteer group, proclaiming that they were extremely tenacious and energetic, never tired of battles, and able to withstand round-the-clock operations.
是在由陈纳德他看了苏联人的一些战术之后，他又产生了一些灵感，包括苏联人会互相掩护，他们会用 I-16战斗机去俯冲日本的飞机，他就知道说可以靠这种俯冲攻击的方式去。 更灵活的日本飞机缠斗。
April 29th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito's birthday, was always celebrated by a festival. Chennault had a hunch that Japanese airmen would launch an intensive air raid as a gift for their emperor. So he suggested that the Soviet volunteer group and China's Air Force set a trap. The day before, all the Soviet and Chinese aircraft pretended to fly out, creating a false impression that there were no aircraft left to defend the city. But after an hour, all the aircraft secretly came back. The Japanese took the bait. On the 29th, escorted by 24 fighters, 15 bombers attacked Wuhan. Chinese aircraft were waiting for them. Although 11 of them were shot down, the Japanese still had to confront another 40 Soviet aircraft on their return to base. The sun was on the Soviets' backs. In 30 minutes, 36 enemy aircraft were shot down. Just 3 escaped. Japan suffered its worst loss since the invasion. Chennault thought it was the most brilliant air battle he had ever seen, a masterpiece of planning and execution. Soviet pilot Grigory Timoshenko's grave is located in Xishan Park, Chongqing. He was a group captain in the Soviet volunteer group. His aircraft was damaged in the defense of Wuhan. When his plane was hit by enemy fire, he fought to keep it from populated areas. He crashed in the Yangtze River and drowned. He was buried by the local Chinese. With Soviet support, China's Air Force survived. Japan's monopoly in the sky was broken, forcing them to move their airfields far from the front lines.
没有他们那个援助，中国这几年了就完了。你不管怎么看观想，苏联的志愿那个飞行员来中国啊，有些打了3次4次，等于轮换训练，所以苏联来中国的飞行员啊，死了不少。
The Soviet aid came at a critical time for China. 236 Soviet airmen sacrificed their lives in China.
但是随着时间慢慢这样下来，中国空军所能训练的人员和所有的这个飞机硬体都已经受到相当程度的损伤。虽然跟苏联合作，苏联也援助了一些飞机，苏联也派了飞行员过来帮助中国作战，但是那个在数量上、程度上飞机的性能上都还是不能够跟日本相比的。所以到了1940年之后，中国的领空基本上就是日本的天下。
The situation again became desperate. 1940 was a tense year for Europe. Anticipating war with Germany, the Soviets gradually recalled their volunteer group. It was a prescient move. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. In the first 9 days, the Soviets lost 4,614 airplanes. So complete was the catastrophe that the Soviets stopped aiding China and withdrew the last of their volunteers. China again faced the abyss. Madame Chang and Chennault both understood that for China to keep fighting, its air force must be rebuilt and strictly trained according to Chennault's standard. Chennault established a fighter training school in Zhejiang. 2 months later, Chennault and the school moved to Kunming in southwest China. Chennault ended up staying in Kunming much longer than in any other Chinese city. He called it his second home. China's new Air Force Officer School was at Kunming's Wujaba Airfield, next to Dian Lake. It was staffed by a dozen former U.S. Army Air Force officers. According to Chennault, his students were strong young men, excellent pilots, eager for action. Together, they would build a modern Air Force in China. But that was a long way off. It takes time to train fighter pilots. But time was the one thing China didn't have. What it needed was pilots who could immediately join the battle. Chennault had tried to get pilots for years. In Christmas 1939, he visited America. At that time, he sent information he had collected on Japan's Air Force to a U.S. Army Air Force intelligence officer. It included a detailed report on the new Nakajima Type 97 fighter. His report was returned, rejected. The American analysts refused to believe the Japanese could make such an advanced plane. But in fact, just before he came back, Chennault had first-hand experience of the impossible fighter. Chennault also applied to be reinstated in the U.S. Army Air Force. That too was rejected. Frustrated at home, Chennault returned to China at the beginning of 1940. For him, the sky in China was much wider. There he could at least fly as he wanted, and he could put his theories into practice. His decision was proved correct. A huge opportunity awaited him in China. In 1940, Japanese aircraft ran wild in China's sky, raining down destruction on the defenseless population. After the Soviets' withdrawal, there was nothing to stop them. While Japan had more than 800 fighting aircraft, there was barely anything left of Chinese Air Force. Japan carried out wanton bombing on southwest China. Chongqing, the wartime capital, was brutally hit. During the first 6 months of bombing, Japan dropped 350,000 tons of bombs. That's equal to 1/3 of the total amount of bombs dropped on Japan during the entire war. The conflagration was enormous. Because Chinese houses were made of wood and bamboo, half the city was in ruins. Chennault was in Chongqing during the bombing, but he didn't hide in the shelters. Instead, he stood outside studying the Japanese aircraft and their tactics. While his own country rejected his theories, he would put them to good use in China. But he still needed pilots and planes to put them into practice. Ironically, he got them from the very country that rejected him, the United States. But China was not the only country in the queue for aid. Most of Europe had fallen to Nazi Germany. Only Britain and the Soviet Union remained unconquered, and they too clamored for American supplies. By the end of 1940, President Roosevelt was devising ways to get around the neutrality laws. He stressed that isolation was no longer an option for America. Having just won his third presidential election and wanting to support China and Britain, in December 1940, Roosevelt appealed to the Congress, proclaiming that America must be the great arsenal of democracy. Japan's never-ending savage bombing brought huge pressure on the Chinese government. Chiang Kai-shek knew that morale would falter if Japan continued unopposed in the air. What he needed was America's best fighter planes. He ordered his envoy in Washington, TV Song, to get them. And he asked Chennault to return to America to do everything possible to get planes and pilots for China. Chennault and Mao Bangchu, chief commander of China's Air Force, joined at TV Song in Washington. These were desperate times. The situation in the Far East was deteriorating rapidly. With the defeat of France in Europe, Japan seized the French colonies in Southeast Asia, simultaneously threatening China with war on a new front and threatening British and American interests in Asia. But America wasn't ready for war. It tried to buy time by letting China hold Japan. In December 1940, Roosevelt announced a $100 million loan to China and ordered relevant government departments to work out a military aid plan.
At this point in 1940, he's got the restrictions of a Congress that's not going to support it, with an American public that is not going to support it. But he said, no, we must support China.
Chennault tried to help America prepare for war. This time, he provided it with original intelligence about Japan's most advanced fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M. The world would soon know it by another name, Zero. But he was again ignored. The Zero was Japan's newest fighter. Appearing in 1940, it was one of the most extraordinary airplanes of the war. Famous for its rapid rate of climb, high speed, and extreme maneuverability, the Zero could best any plane then in the air. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was all but unbeatable in a dogfight. Earlier in the year, it had all but blown the Chinese Air Force and the Soviet volunteers out of the sky. On September 13th, 27 Japanese bombers, escorted by 13 Zero fighters, attacked Chongqing. 30 Chinese Air Force fighters waited for them over Bishan. In the ferocious battle, 27 Chinese fighters were shot down. Japan lost none.
失败原因就在于说，日本把它新锐的04战斗机投入战场上去。那我们空军的苏联制，我们那个时候都用苏联制的115、116，已经没有能力再跟那么灵活，然后航程又那么远的飞机作战了。大概在 B3空战，913 B3空战，我们就死了10个人，10个飞行员都是国家精英。
It was a complete shock for the nationalist government. Chiang Kai-shek was angry at his useless Air Force. The Zero became famous after this battle.
这只有啊，这个也不算中国打的人还是很认真的，这个飞机不如人家嘛，比不上零式飞机啊。零式飞机当时富航那个中岛试行了轻轰炸机来炸成都的嘛。原来事前啊，一炸过太平之前，有一架飞机啊，日本飞机降落。 那个日本飞机来前警报啊，机场那个旁边啊插了红的红旗啊，小红旗，它降落以后把红旗拔掉就飞回去，还有这个事情了嘛？好像这样，都中国没什么飞机打了的时候好惨的，那个真的有歧视啊！他把那红旗拿掉了，上飞机就走了。
However, the U.S. military had no record of this most advanced fighter in the world until the attack on Pearl Harbor. At that time, America thought Japan lacked the capacity to build a modern air force.
The American military had very little respect for the Japanese military. They didn't believe the hard intelligence that General Chennault was supplying them. They didn't believe there'd be a fighter plane like a Zero with a 1,000-mile range with its speed and maneuverability.
Even more arrogantly, Americans believed that even if the Japanese had the planes, they couldn't fly them.
Most Westerners thought they were squinty-eyed, they had buck teeth. A lot of the propaganda was the Japanese couldn't follow you into the sun because they squinted and they couldn't see.
The Americans thought that the Japanese had neither the planes nor the pilots to conduct a war. They would pay a heavy price for their arrogance. At the beginning of 1941, Chennault submitted a detailed plan for creating the American Volunteer Group. He claimed that if China could be provided with planes and pilots from the U.S., air power alone would be able to destroy the Japanese invader.
Give me 100 planes, 200 planes, 300 planes, and we'll fight the Japanese to a standoff. This was a pipe dream, but it was very attractive.
But sometimes dreams come true.
Part of the complication was, of course, the U.S. was officially neutral. Although China was at war with Japan, the United States was not at war with Japan, and nor was the United States ready to go to war with Japan. So providing China an advanced, what was hoped for, an advanced air force, or at least part of an advanced air force, would be an indirect way or covert way of fighting Japan without committing the United States prematurely to a war.
Inspired by Roosevelt, the Department of State, the Army, the Navy, and the Treasury Department agreed to tie down Japanese troops within China by providing China with air aid. It came in the form of 100 P-40 fighters. They were America's first modern fighters and were the first American planes to fight Japanese fighters in China's sky. In April 1941, the first batch of P-40s were shipped from New York Harbor. They were sent via Rangoon, Burma. Only 99 arrived in Rangoon because one plane was accidentally dropped into the water during loading. Now they had planes, but no pilots. Chennault and TV Sung tried to recruit pilots from the U.S. military, but were blocked by the U.S. military commanders. Chennault was rudely told, no pilots, no crew. The recruiting team was thrown off U.S. military bases. It took direct intercession by President Roosevelt to break the deadlock. He authorized U.S. servicemen to resign their commissions so that they could fight in China. Their true mission was kept under wraps. The pilots and aircrew went to China undercover. Their contract said that they worked for Camco, a civilian aviation company. The details of their employment were not specified. Their real mission was to fly P-40s in China, fight the Japanese, and defend the Burma Road and cities in southwest China. And there was a bonus. Unofficially, they were told that the Chinese government would pay a bounty of $500 for every Japanese plane shot down. Pilots were not the only target. If the AVG wanted to operate as an independent Army group, it had to recruit mechanics, armorers, radio operators, meteorologists, administrators, even doctors, nurses, and pastors as well.
The contract basically stated that they would be allowed to resign their commissions in the Army, the Navy, or the Marine Corps for 1 year, with the understanding that they would re-enlist at their prior rank and continue on in their service. Payment was very good. They would be making more than three times their normal base pay or flight pay as lieutenants or ensigns in their respective services.
The contract terms were extremely attractive. $250 per month for secretaries, mechanics, and ground crew, and up to $750 for pilots. Compared to that, Air Force pilots in the U.S. only got about $200, mechanics just $100. The combination of a good salary and adventure appealed to many American pilots.
Some of them even knew what they were getting into, but it was something to do. It was a new experience. It gave them a chance to apply their skills, their flying skills, and a lot of them didn't like being under the military, being under the thumb of the military.
So, as young and dedicated and loyal as we were, China, my God, we're looking forward to go to China more than anybody else was. So we signed up, and it wasn't too long later we got called in and had an honorable discharge for us.
After signing their contracts, the new recruits were given train tickets to San Francisco. Once assembled there, they boarded a ship for Burma.
We went on board the ship. We were all supposed to be sort of incognito. And around San Francisco, we didn't go out there as pilots. We went out as a whole bunch of different things.
I think I was supposed to be a plantation manager of what, I don't know, but that was just simply a ploy, I guess, by the State Department to try to cover up the idea that we were going over to get into trouble with the Japanese.
And I remember my uncle came down to see me off. And I heard later he turned to my mother and he said, "We'll never see that boy again."
I remember shedding a few tears when I told my mother and dad goodbye. But I felt good about it, and I told them I'd write them.
On July 10, 1941, the first volunteers set off from San Francisco. Their mission didn't stay secret for long. A Japanese radio station announced their intention to sink the ship.
And from Hawaii, we were out one night, and then all of a sudden everything slowed down. And we looked there, and there was two heavy cruisers, one on each side of us. The Northampton on one side and the Salt Lake City on the other.
The U.S. Navy escorted the valuable cargo across the Pacific. Chennault had done the impossible. Although he was disappointed at the small number of planes and pilots, he at last had an Air Force under his own command. He wrote in his diary that night that for the first time ever, he got what he needed to defeat the Japanese. He was going to show the world how fighters could rule the sky. And he'd start with the AVG in China. In 1941, a motley dressed group of Americans sailed across the Pacific. They looked innocent enough, trying to keep themselves occupied on the long voyage. Their documents said they were plantation owners, teachers, businessmen, even missionaries. few who saw this ragtag group would have guessed that they would soon become one of the most famous military units in history. The American volunteer group entered the war through the back door. Literally. By the time they arrived in Asia, Japan controlled all of China's ports. So they traveled to Rangoon, Burma. In 1941, Burma was still a British colony. It was a convenient place for the Tigers to set up shop. They arrived without fanfare. As a private air force skirting neutrality laws, they deliberately kept a low profile. Contracted by the Chinese government, the AVG was recruited by and under the command of General Claire Chennault. They initially moved inland and set up base deep inside Burma. It was not what the young American airmen looking for adventure had in mind. Living conditions were difficult. Heat was a problem, as were the insects. When eating, the airmen used two plates, one with the food and the other to cover it. When sleeping, they had nets to protect them from mosquitoes, but they couldn't protect them from the rats that fell from the ceiling. Chennault had his own idea of how to run an air force. Being a clandestine unit, they had no uniforms. To build esprit de corps, he did away with unnecessary regulations. He even abolished saluting. Chennault valued results. He didn't care how they were achieved.
But you know, Mitch, that's one of the reasons he got in trouble, because he didn't act like the formal military. His men wore what they wanted to wear. They said one time Tex Hill went up in an airplane in his underwear and cowboy boots.
A U.S. Army general described them as the worst troops I have ever seen. The British based near Rangoon simply called them rogues. But military men were distracted by the AVG's outward appearance. The lack of discipline had no effect on their courage. Their critics ignored that the AVG were civilians, not soldiers. When the shooting started, they proved they were worth more than proper soldiers. The AVG's success stemmed from Chennault's superior tactics and training. He didn't care much for parade ground routine. He spent all his time teaching his airmen how to knock the Japanese out of the sky. Chennault developed a rigorous training program and enforced rigid flight discipline. He taught them his radical tactics for air battle survival. It was based on information about the Japanese Air Force that he collected himself. Chennault's tactics went against everything they had been taught in military flying schools. Pilots under Chennault's command were not allowed to dogfight. They were taught to hit and dive.
So he's seeing the Russians and how they do against the Japanese. What Chennault learned was basically to take the strongest points of American-built aircraft and use them against the weakest points of the Japanese aircraft. So the one thing the American airplanes had was weight and firepower. And the P-40 was one of the fastest diving propeller-driven airplanes of World War II, where they would come in with tremendous speed, with tremendous firepower. Japanese airplanes were not armored. That was one reason for their remarkable maneuverability. So you didn't have to hit them many times. They would, if you hit them with a 50 caliber gun, they would fall apart basically. The important thing was always altitude, height. You have height, you live. You don't have height, you die. Chennault took this to the basic tenet of his air combat training. Stay above the Japanese, attack when you were ready to attack, do a very fast dive by beyond 500 miles an hour. Then you have what's called a zoom recovery. Your momentum from that tremendous speed helps you regain your altitude. Come back again. Do not engage the Japanese in aerial combat. If they want to fight, go away.
The P-40 was the same speed of the Japanese airplane, actually in open, but the P-40 could dive faster than any plane there was. So the effectiveness of this dive and hit became the part of the thing.
The AVG ace Tex Hill once said, "Chennault's tactical lesson was impressive. He taught us how to fight and made us believe that he knew how to deal with the Japanese planes." Contrary to conventional battle theory, Chennault taught his pilots to avoid engaging in dogfights, which the more maneuverable Japanese planes were sure to win. The unconventional hit-and-run tactic was based on Chennault's years of experience. It became the secret of their success.
Most of his pilots were not fighter pilots, so he had to start from the basics. They tend to land an airplane hard. So there were many crashes in training in Burma. Several pilots were killed in training accidents. You know, a little blood you give in training saves a lot of blood in combat. Once the fighting began, and once they actually had met the Japanese, thank God they had listened to him, because he told them exactly right.
Training under Chennault was rigorous, both on the ground and in the air. But after the training, Chennault was very easygoing as a standard Southern gentleman.
He didn't care. They called him the old man, you know, not always to his face, but I think occasionally. And they said on the baseball field when he played baseball with them that, you know, he pitched and they would holler at him about pitching or umpiring or whatever he did, like they did anybody else on the team. But, you know, they never really made that special place. He treated them as equals, not as being their superiors.
The tough-looking old man used to say that his office door was always open. The AVG went to China with 100 planes. So many were damaged during the training that when combat began in 1941, just 43 planes were airworthy. They were spread between 3 squadrons: Adam and Eve, Panda Bears, and Hell's Angels. Although each squadron had its own emblem, their planes all shared one distinctive feature: a large shark mouth in the front of each aircraft.
The shark's mouth looks like it came out of the factory that way. It just looked right. It covered that radiator. It made it look sexy. Now, the interesting thing is, if you talk to fighter pilots who flew the entire family of P-40s in China, they didn't call them P-40s, they called them sharks.
The AVG did not originate the design. German and Australian squadrons painted the shark mouth on their planes first. One of Chennault's pilots saw a shark-mouthed Australian P-40 in a magazine and decided to paint his own. Chennault loved the idea. Soon enough, every P-40 had a menacing shark mouth. With the pilots' training complete, and with the plane's war paint on, the AVG was ready to go to war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor broke the last shackle holding the AVG back. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet's main base, Pearl Harbor. "18 warships were sunk, 188 aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,000 people were killed." In a speech to the nation, President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Isolationist voices were silenced, and America went to war. While Roosevelt raged against the Japanese attack, the reaction of Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek was decidedly different.
He sang a Chinese opera aria to the whole staff. It was as if he was floating. Now America was in the war, no limits to Lend-Lease. And he said, you know, there'll be fighter planes, there'll be weapons, there'll be money.
Even old leather-faced Chennault was reckoned to have cracked a smile at the news. The Allies quickly established the China-Burma-India Theater. Chiang was named as Supreme Allied Commander in China. In his diary, Chiang Kai-shek confessed that he was flattered by his appointment. Now China enjoys unprecedented high reputation and status. I fear the undeserved title. Chennault and his men learned the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the hot and humid jungle backwater of Burma. Much closer to the Japanese than any other U.S. Air Force units, they realized that they were now in the front line of the war.
We're training in Burma, and what happened, I was standing on a P-40 one day, and a fellow from the radio shack came out and he said, "Joe, they just bombed Pearl Harbor." So I said, "You're kidding?" He said, "No." So right away we dispersed all of our airplanes around the field, and we were on alert from then on.
Chennault told his men that from then on, they didn't have to battle in secret, and that the AVG were now not just fighting for China, but also for America. Chennault had to split his meager force. One squadron stayed to protect Rangoon. The other two squadrons moved to Kunming, China. The other two squadrons moved to Kunming, China on December 18th. So did Chennault's headquarters.
It was pretty much of a mess. They'd been in war so long that a lot of the towns had been bombed out or bombed. And all I know is that the AVG, wherever we went, we got the best food there was and the best treatment from the Chinese.
Yunlong, governor of Yunnan province, provided his private residence for Chennault. The quarters for the airmen were in Kunhan Normal School, with facilities including tennis courts, a library, and a shooting range. Each pilot had his own room. The Chongqing government even set up a service group to do laundry, cooking, and other chores.
They treated us with the best they could. They used to make cookies in for us, come and bring cookies. They took care of us like their own, or better than their own.
With its pleasant climate, comfortable living conditions, and a standard American food, Kunming brought relief from the swarms of mosquitoes and primitive living conditions at the Burma base. The move to Kunming was not without mishap. 3 planes crashed on the journey. One pilot who crash-landed had a narrow escape. The language barrier almost cost him his life. Mistaking anyone who flew as Japanese, he was captured by locals. He was lucky not to be killed on the spot. Thereafter, a piece of silk stamped with the Chinese flag was sewn on every AVG flight jacket with the words, "This foreign person has come to China to help in the war effort. Soldiers and civilians, one and all, should rescue, protect, and provide him with medical care." The AVG called it their blood chit. It saved the lives of countless American pilots shot down during the war.
同一天，在他们到达昆明降落前，日本人就对昆明来了一次轰炸。那志愿队的人，他们那时候刚好到了他们一到昆明就到市区去看那些情景，他们就看到一堆断垣残壁，一堆中国人被炸的，那个四肢都飞到电线杆上去，或肠子跑出来。那美国人看到是很受不了，他们就看到之后，他们就下定决心，一定要在第2天的空战中给日本人好看。
At last, it was time to put their training to the test. In the morning of December 20th, 10 Japanese bombers attacked Kunming. They thought the city was defenseless. Chennault ordered 24 aircraft to take off. He had staked his career on this moment. Up till then, the Japanese had been invincible in the air. Neither the Chinese, the American, nor the British Air Forces had been able to stop them. Would Chennault's motley crew be able to deliver on his promise to wipe the Japanese from the air?
We got up to altitude. We knew that we were above the Japanese bombers. Pretty soon there's a formation of 10 Japanese planes. We'd never seen a Japanese plane in the air. And here they came. We knew we had them.
The AVG dived and launched their attack on the Japanese aircraft, just as Chennault had taught them.
When I pressed the trigger, no guns. And I thought, oh, and I've used a lot of 4-letter words, but I pulled off immediately. I was so excited that I had turned it off and on so many times I left it off. Then I immediately turned it back on, of course, and got back in combat. And we just hit them from all directions.
6 Japanese were shot down. 3 were heavily damaged. Only 1 escaped. Just 1 AVG fighter was slightly damaged. Chennault got the result he promised, but he remained impassive when debriefing the returned pilots. He praised them for their success, but pointed out their weaknesses exposed during the battle. He exhorted them to do even better the next time. Chennault may not have been satisfied with the victory, but others were. Many local civilians watched the air battle in awe. It was the first time they had seen Japanese planes bested. People in Kunming were elated. Some carried Japanese wreckage in triumph. Others celebrated the victory in more conventional ways.
They're happy, you know, they would wave at you, and you could see the difference, the smiles on their face, you know.
这大概是日本零式战斗机出现之后，首次中国空军在空中第一次击退日本的飞机，取得大胜。那昆明人民的士气就大振，因为他们觉得说，终于我们有人来保护我们了。所以志愿队在从那个时候开始，他们就被视为英雄看待。
对昆明老百姓而言，这是个相当重大的一个战果，可以免除被轰炸。
The AVG had even greater success defending Rangoon. From the end of 1941, the Japanese fiercely bombed Rangoon. In the severely damaged city, the Rangoon Great Golden Stupa was the only landmark that survived the bombing. Covered in gold, the 1,000-year-old building was the oldest and most expensive stupa in the world. Perhaps because Burma and Japan are both Buddhist countries, merciful Japanese pilots allowed the building to survive. In wartime, it was the safest place in Rangoon. However, the Rangoon Great Golden Stupa couldn't protect the rest of the city. On December 23rd, 48 Japanese bombers and 20 fighter escorts attacked Rangoon. They were intercepted by the 3rd Squadron of the AVG.
And I picked up on a bomber that was off to one side a little bit from the main formation and opened up at about maybe 200 yards and bored in directly astern. And saw flashes all over the place, and the next thing I know, the damn thing blew up in front of me, and I was blown up like a leaf. And I remember the greatest feeling of glee that I guess I've ever felt at knowing that I had blown this guy out of the sky.
"12 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The AVG lost 2 planes and 2 pilots. "22-year-old wingman Henry Gilbert was the first AVG pilot killed in battle. Recruited soon after his marriage, his wife was then 6 months pregnant. Chennault wrote to her of her husband's death.
There are letters that he's written home that said losing them is like losing one of his own children. They were some of the best pilots that he had ever been around in his life, and he'd been around many, and he had taught many. And so to lose one of them, he said, was like losing one of his own. And I think it hurt him deeply every time they didn't come home.
Gilbert's death made it personal. The AVG wasn't just fighting for China. They wanted revenge for themselves. On December 25th, the Japanese sent a massive fleet to bomb Rangoon and to wipe out its air defenses. They were met by a combined force of 12 AGV P-40s and 16 RAF fighters.
On Christmas Day, 1941, this was the big day. The Japanese said they're coming over with a lot of Christmas gifts for us. They came over with about 100 fighters and bombers. And on that day, we destroyed 25, I think, or 24 Japanese airplanes without a single loss.
Each of us got a couple of bombers. They were dropping like flies. They were rolling out of the formation, wings coming off, blowing up. It was a scene of like something out of hell.
The AVG lost 2 planes, but no pilots were injured. The Japanese gave the Americans a present, all right, just not the one they intended. The result was a huge gift to China and its allies.
They lost most of their pilots in that raid, you know. They said they lost the best 2 fighter pilots they had in that raid.
But even victory costs. The AVG was rapidly running out of planes. Because of the scarcity of spare parts, there were at most 20 aircraft available for each combat.
And props and tires, you just couldn't get. That's all. We tried to get them from the Philippines, you know, when the Philippines folded up, but then it was difficult to get them in there.
The 20 serviceable AVG planes were severely outnumbered by over 300 Japanese aircraft. Critically, the AVG lost pilots as well as planes. Robert Sandrell, the flight leader of the 1st Squadron, was the first leader killed in action. Before he died, he had already got 5 planes. Each AVG squadron suffered casualties in the battle. The losses were crucial. Planes and pilots were irreplaceable. "44-year-old Louis Hoffman was the oldest AVG pilot. During the combat in Rangoon, he grappled with 5 Japanese aircraft before he was killed. He was one of the few AVGs who was married and had children. He once said the reason he chose to come to China was because he was able to fight. He felt happy and worthy. So did the young and fearless airmen.
We, as young, adventurous, dedicated boys, we did the best we could with what we had, and they didn't give up. We didn't give up.
At the end of 1941 and early 1942, the legend of the American volunteer group spread rapidly. At the start of the Pacific War, the Japanese appeared invincible. The Allies were losing the war and were hungry for a victory. That a small air unit won a series of battles surprised the whole world. The AVG became famous and got a new nickname.
首先呢，重庆的报纸啊，是看什么呢？它这个飞机啊，如虎添翼啊，在天上，如虎添翼，咱们一个意思的报道的。就这个如虎添翼，这个飞机像这个还是飞天空的服了嘛。
Chinese press had dubbed us flying tigers. And so when our little cavalcades went through town on the way from our hostel to the airfield or whatever, these people would all cheer and they were all very happy with us. And of course, we were happy to be greeted that way.
The American media quickly picked up on the name. Soon everyone was talking about the Flying Tigers. The Walt Disney Company even designed an insignia for them, a winged tiger flying through a large V for victory. In February 1942, Generalissimo and Madame Chang came to Kunming in person. They gave a banquet for AVG members in the #1 AVG hostel. During the dinner, Chang spoke highly of the AVG. With its record of 1 against 30 Japanese, the American Volunteer Group was the bravest air unit of all. Madame Chang called them her angels. Madame Chiang Kai-shek enchanted not only Chennault, but also the pilots. In a letter home, John Donovan wrote, "She looked vivacious, attractive, energetic, with a much more striking personality than most any other woman I have ever seen. We cheered her to the rafters time and again." During the banquet, Madame Chang earned the respect and admiration of all. Madame Chang expressed her willingness to be the unit's honorary commander and the conduit between the AVG and Shanghai Shek. Later, on behalf of the Chinese Cultural Society, she presented a painting of an eagle as a gift for the AVG. In these, the darkest days of war with Japan, the AVG had become the symbol of victory. China was physically isolated. With Japan controlling China's ports, the only way to get supplies to China was overland. The Burma Road, constructed right after the Japanese invasion, was the most important access to international support. It was entirely built by people in Yunnan, under the most trying conditions, and usually only with hand tools. In less than 10 months, from November 1937 to September 1938, people in Yunnan constructed the road with their own hands through the mountains and valleys. It was 1,153 kilometers long, from Lashio to Kunming. More than 200,000 laborers, including a large number of ethnic minorities, the elderly, even women carrying babies and children, worked on the road. In that period, as many as 2,300 people died building the road. The Burma Road was China's crucial link to aid and materials from the outside world. It was the only link China was able to hold until America entered the war. More than 4 times as much vital war material came via the road than on all other ways into China combined. In early 1942, the Tigers were fighting a war on 2 fronts. The Tigers helped secure both ends of the vital Burma Road by keeping the skies clear over both Kunming and Rangoon. In northern Burma, Chennault faced a very grim situation. While Japan had 400 to 500 aircraft available for combat there, the combined force of the AVG and the RAF was down to just 30 fighters and a handful of bombers. Facing such numerical superiority, Chennault ordered his Flying Tigers to avoid direct engagement with the enemy. Instead, they applied guerrilla tactics. In late March, Chennault launched the Chiang Mai Raid. They destroyed about 20 Japanese aircraft. However, in this operation, John Newkirk, the 2nd Squadron leader, was killed by gunfire. By the time he died, he was a double ace, having destroyed 10 enemy aircraft. On March 25, 1942, the New York Times featured Newkirk's death with his photo. The Japanese were furious at Chennault's guerrilla tactics. They used the radio to threaten the Flying Tigers, saying they would be shown no mercy if they continued using guerrilla tactics. baptized by fire over the Burma sky, the volunteers were no longer babies.
When they went down to Rangoon and fought in Rangoon, and when they came back, they had aged 10 years. If I had seen that in a film, I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought it was an exaggeration on the director's part. They were men when they came back. They just turned into men overnight.
Yet in the end, the air defense of Burma was futile. Japan's infantry overwhelmed the Allied ground troops and forced Britain to abandon Burma. The Flying Tigers regrouped in China. They soon faced their biggest ever challenge. Ironically, it wasn't against planes, but against Japanese ground troops. The Battle of the Salween Gorge was a turning point in the war. The Salween, or Nu, River is the boundary between China and Burma. The steep river gorge is a natural moat protecting China's southwest flank. In May 1942, it was the only thing that stood between China and the massive Japanese army in Burma. On May 5th, the Japanese were shocked to find a Japanese division attempting to cross the river.
那陈纳德收到命令，必须在大批部队没赶到怒江对峙之前呢，必须把这些人阻挡在怒江里面。所以他派了飞机去炸。
Fortunately, Chennault had received 6 new model P-40s. They were equipped to carry bombs under their wings. But the AVG had to make the bombs themselves.
We were working on a gasoline bomb too, you know. Fill the thing with gasoline and put some kind of a detonator on it. And we were trying to make anything we could to use, you know, to bomb them. We bombed them. We found these big old bombs, 500-pound bombs, and loaded them up and bombed them and strafed them.
那这场任务是还蛮成功的，就是说，如同计划的，他们制造了那个土石流，把日本人的坂口支队给淹了。淹了之后，然后霍克81A 再从空中下来扫射剩下的日军部队。
他把那个山炸垮了以后，整个山瘫下来，因为他单行道。 把山炸垮下以后，把整个山路迷了以后扫射，日本人结果为了那边死伤惨重，最后还是没有堵挡在怒江那边，没办法再继续前进。
After the 4-day battle, Chennault reported to Chiang that the only vehicles on the Burma Road were those fleeing back to Burma.
And that saved southern China, saved us. Saved India. I mean, it was an important place for combat.
所以我认为这个战斗从军心士气上来看，还是从实质上来看，都是有非常重大意义的。就他把中国的后方保护下来了。
The exhausted pilots and their maverick commander, with their limited supplies, homemade bombs, and worn-out aircraft, performed a miracle. The motley crew may never have saluted, but they fought like tigers. By mid-1942, the war had become one of attrition. The Flying Tigers regrouped at Chongqing to defend China's wartime capital. Chennault bluffed the Japanese with only 4 aircraft patrolling every day and 12 fake aircraft made of bamboo and paper on the airfield.
They made these planes looked like our airplanes, but actually they were false airplanes. The Japanese would come in, probably strafe them, and to find out there was nothing but paper and wood, you know. Actually, it took time to do it, but the Chinese were innovators, you know, they could do anything.
They may have had to rely on paper tigers on the ground, but even in limited numbers, the Tigers were potent in the air. With an acute shortage of planes, Chennault changed his strategy. Now they would attack the Japanese planes while they were on the ground. From the end of 1941 to July 4th, 1942, the Flying Tigers were involved in more than 100 combat missions in Burma and China. With only a handful of planes, they are credited with having shot down 299 enemy aircraft. Their early victories made the volunteers famous. Hollywood even made a John Wayne movie about them. In China, they were heroes. AVG may have been short for America Volunteer Group, but for many Chinese, it simply meant America Very Good. Part of the AVG's success was the result of an early warning system. Chennault called it his bamboo radar. It enabled the Tigers to get their planes in the air before Japanese bombers arrived. This gave the P-40s the vital height advantage they needed. The alarm signal was a large black paper ball rising to the top of the airfield flagpole. When a second black ball rose, it meant that the enemy aircraft were 20 minutes away. A third black ball meant there were 10 minutes left. Lying in wait at high altitude gave the AVG a tactical advantage. They could use their great diving speed to swoop down on the invaders. The Flying Tigers were the most successful unit in the war against Japan. Yet their very success hastened the unit's demise.
The rumors get as far back as January and February that we were going to be, pulled back into the service. And nobody really knew for sure what was going to happen.
We began amongst all of us to talk about possible induction. What's going to happen to us, Here we are, the American Volunteer Group.
The American Army Air Force coveted the Flying Tigers' enviable combat record. And they coveted Chennault's ace pilots. With the American Air Force itself at last deploying in China, it didn't want any rival. The U.S. Army 23rd Fighter Group hoped to absorb the AVG. The U.S. military commanders hoped that the experienced Flying Tigers would rejoin the U.S. Air Force. It needed them.
The pilots who would replace the American Volunteer Group pilots were trained fighter pilots. They had not, for the most part, there were a few exceptions, they had not seen aerial combat. A significant group, but they needed to learn. They had a high target to reach for. They had to prove themselves to the other pilots, that they were good enough to be Flying Tigers.
But old rivalries and ham-fisted negotiators sank the deal.
就是说，很多人就觉得心里不痛快。事实上，他们已经离开美国1年了，在中国也作战了7个月，吃不好喝不好，精神压力，他们需要休息。陈纳德说，如果当初他愿意给他们1个月的休息时间，那些人都会很高兴的回来中国继续参加战斗。
Chennault's success made the American commanders uncomfortable. Orders came that the AVG was to be disbanded on Independence Day, the 4th of July, 1942. But they didn't go quietly. There was one more battle. The same day, 12 Japanese aircraft attempted to attack Hanyang Airfield. 4 Flying Tigers intercepted them. They shot down 6 of the Japanese planes. It was the AVG's last engagement. Later that day, the AVG officially ceased to exist. Upon disbandment, most Tigers returned home. A few answered Chennault's call to help the handover. John Peacock was the first pilot to get married in China. His bride was Emma Jane Foster, a nurse in the Flying Tigers. They were not supposed to get married. It wasn't on the contract, but in the unwritten words. However, Chennault was very fond of these 2 young people. He not only allowed their marriage, but also held their wedding in Kunming. Now it was time to go home. Peacock agreed to stay an additional 2 weeks to help the handover. He never made it home. He was just 24 when he was shot down, leaving a pregnant wife behind. The AVG started with 99 pilots. It lost 23 pilots in total, 4 in aerial battles, the rest to ground fire and training accidents. When they were disbanded, 25 were aces, credited with shooting down 5 or more enemy planes. Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek held a farewell party for the AVG members at which they expressed their gratitude. From founding to disbandment, the AVG cost China $8 million. Chennault felt sorry for that and apologized to the finance minister, TV Sung. The finance minister replied, "It was the best investment ever. You are concerned about the cost. It is I who should feel ashamed." Upon disbandment, most of the Tigers returned to the U.S., where they rejoined their former units. Some stayed in China, where, with the China National Aviation Corporation, they started another perilous mission, flying the notorious Hump route over the Himalayas. Chennault rejoined the U.S. Army Air Force and stayed in China. The U.S. Army Air Force and the China-America Combined Wing inherited the name and the insignia of the Flying Tigers and used them until the end of the war. They would carry forward the glory of the Flying Tigers in China's sky.
The 14th Air Force came in and they called the Flying Tigers. We said, no, the Flying Tigers is one, that was AVG. We're a separate group completely. We're civilians. We are not military, we are civilians. We're American Volunteer Group, and that's the difference of Flying Tigers.
The snow-capped mountains, glaciers, and valleys of the eastern Himalayas sparkle in the sun. But it's not only ice that makes them glitter. On clear days, shattered pieces of aluminum glisten in the sunlight. This is the infamous Aluminum Alley, the Hump route. Pilots who flew over the Hump said they didn't need a compass. There were so many crashed planes along the route that they could navigate by the wrecks below.
Well, the reason they call the hump the camel hump. See, Dinjiang is the lower part of the camel. Then you get over the north of Missionary, then you're going up one of the river, and then when you get over the river, then you got the hump. And then after you get the hump, then you got the neck of the camel.
From early 1942, the Hump route, flying over the Himalayas, was the only channel for supplies to reach China. It was the lifeline that kept China supplied in the darkest days of the war.
There was no sea transportation into China. The Japanese controlled the coasts. There was no land transportation to China. The only way was through Japanese-occupied Burma.
1942 was the most difficult and critical year in World War II. From Europe to Asia and then to the Pacific, the fierce war and the feeling of imminent collapse had knocked the breath out of the Allies. The Japanese attack pushed the British out of Burma, cutting the last link into China, the Burma Road. With the road cut, China was completely isolated.
我们这一战的胜败，不仅关于我们国家民族的阵亡，更是关于全世界人类的后果。我们这一战经历了以立定大事不报的基础，如果失败了，就要接着败血复活的经历。
The situation was desperate. The Allies feared that without arms and ammunition, China would be forced to surrender. If that happened, the Japanese could transfer millions of soldiers from China to other battlefields. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked the Congress to grant aid to China. But granting aid was just the first step. They also had to figure out how to get it to China. The Japanese may cut the Burma Road, but I want to say to the gallant people of China that no matter what advances the Japanese may make, ways will be found to deliver airplanes and munitions of war to the armies of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. We remember that the Chinese people were the first to stand up and fight against the aggressors in this war. American senior political and military officials believed that supporting China would not only prevent the Japanese from deploying troops to Southeast Asia, but would also supply air bases in China from which American planes could bomb the Japanese homeland. While the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in bloody battles with the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Pacific Ocean, China was the main battlefield against the Japanese forces on land.
中国战场对美国在二战来讲，还是一个投资报酬率很高的战场，因为只用的在比例来讲，零头的物质就能够牵制大量的日本军，不使他调到这个东南亚跟太平洋来作战。美国是基于一个全球战略的一个考量，可是中国不是啊。 中国不单单是一个所谓的全球战略，中国是生死存亡的考量。
The massive Japanese army in Burma and China prevented the reopening of the Burma Road, so a highway in the sky was created instead. It went over the Himalaya mountains. Pilots called the air cargo route flying the Hump. The Hump route connected India and China. At one end was India's Assam province, which was the Allied territory closest to the areas under China's control. Assam is located in the northeast corner of India. Before 1942, it was like a rag lying at the end of the world. The Dinjan airfield in Assam was the most important airfield at the Indian end of the Hump route. The Chinese terminus was in Kunming. The constant roaring of Hump aircraft taking off and landing in the Dinjan airfield went on from 1942 until the end of the war. I've flown from Natal to Ascension when the scum wasn't drained from the sumps. But it's nothing compared to the thrills you get in a ship flying over the Hump, across the grim Himalayas. There's a million rock peaks, and you're sweating at 20,000 if the engine as much as squeaks. This is a poem written by an American Hump pilot. In fact, flying over the Hump was far more dangerous than he describes. It is 800 kilometers from Dinjan to Kunming as the crow flies. But then crows don't have to worry about Japanese fighter planes. After the Japanese captured the northern part of Burma, their fighters based there could intercept the defenseless transport planes. As a result, the transport route had to be shifted north to avoid Japanese fighters. But it was a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire. The new route had to pass over the Himalaya mountains, where pilots and planes encountered horrific weather conditions.
The atmosphere is very much like water in the ocean, and the currents and turbulence in the thing would be like being on the surface of the ocean, and the results are pretty much the same way.
There was an ongoing meteorological situation where warm, damp air would come up, turn into thunderstorms, and a thunderstorm is extremely hazardous. A plane gets in it, no matter what size plane it is, can get torn up and thrown off. You don't want to be in a thunderstorm. Every pilot knows that.
We don't close the Hump for weather. And I'll never forget one of the first times I got into one of these icing storms, the propellers would ice up. The leading edge of the propellers would ice up. And after a while, the de-icing equipment would cause these chunks of ice to come off of the propeller, and it would slam into the side of the fuselage, and you'd think the airplane is literally coming apart.
Flying the Hump in bad weather was one of the toughest assignments in aviation. The men and the machines were flying at extreme limits of their endurance. By the war's end, the mountains claimed over 600 planes and over 1,000 crewmen.
危险性啊，就把飞机出毛病，出毛病的话准死无疑。因为掉了以后，你山连山，山套山，几百里后都是山，你怎么出去啊？你出去，你摔死了吗？你跳伞下去后，你也出不去嘛。
If you bailed out at those altitudes, you were going so fast when you hit the ground you would break both of your legs probably.
美军有过记录，人员跳伞正好在野人山一带。二战结束以后，美军进去过搜索，就发现人是跳伞成功，但是降落的时候是腿朝上倒挂在树上，身上只剩一副骷髅架了。
Some pilots called it the highway of death. The air crews flying it were from the U.S. Army Air Force Air Transport Command and the China National Aviation Corporation. War materials and personnel were the main cargo on the hazardous journey. Flying over the Hump was the last stage of a long and perilous journey. Convoys of ships carried their vital cargoes from the west coast of America across the Pacific to Calcutta, India. Sometimes to evade the Japanese Navy, they had to go around the Indian Peninsula to reach Bombay or even Karachi on the west coast of the subcontinent. If so, the distance would exceed 12,000 miles. It was literally a journey halfway around the world. After that, the supplies had to traverse the intricate Indian railway network before finally arriving in Assam, 1,200 miles to the east. Each trip took 4 to 5 months to transport the supplies. Every drop of gasoline, every bullet and artillery shell, every grain, every piece of equipment had to go through the long journey just to arrive in Assam. Finally, it would be loaded onto transport aircraft for the toughest stage of all, the airlift over the Hump. Each plane carried a load of between 3 and 8 tons. Over 700,000 tons of vital war materials were shifted this way. In 1942, the fate of China hung in the balance. Its survival depended on the performance of the planes and the courage of their pilots. Both elements would decide whether the United States transport aircraft were capable of flying over the Himalayas and going beyond its range limit and bringing the supplies to China.
一架飞机里年龄最大的基本上就26、7岁。 机长超过31、2的没有，那都最大的。一个报务员，一个副驾驶都是20、30岁。你想想，实际上是3个孩子。
We were well aware of the threat of flying the Hump was, but when you're 21 or 22 years old, you perceive yourself as being bulletproof. You don't worry about what's going to happen to you.
在一个漏雨的天，倾盆大雨或者说狂风骤起这么一个夜晚，飞一架飞机，在3吨多厚，要从印度飞到中国昆明，就像蚂蚁搬家一样，一点一点、一滴一滴的，把这些东西从印度搬到中国来，支持中国人抗战。
Because each ant could only carry a small amount of cargo, the airlift ran 24 hours around the clock.
从这个7、8月份，全部改夜航，从昆明吃了饭，晚饭6、7点钟再飞印度，飞3个多小时嘛，到滨江大概是11多钟，因为那些装油啊都不是机械，都是人抬的。 我还有一些相片，我找这个几个日子，印度人不够，还拿象大象来帮着抬汽油箱，一装30个小时，在滨江，在装大概半夜3点钟了，从滨江要飞回昆明，天亮了，所以这样避开日本那个空袭，这样子相当艰苦。
From the records of American Hump pilot Stephen Cusack, we could see how intense the flights were. There was no let-up for the Chinese and American pilots flying the Hump. It was like a conveyor belt in the sky. Landing at Kunming Airport after all kinds of dangers, they had only 1 hour's rest. As soon as the plane was unloaded, they had to go right away back to Assam. It takes a lot of money to run a war. Frequently, the transport planes carried huge amounts of paper to India and then came back with the printed paper money. But sometimes the money rained from the sky.
One time, a friend of my father have the airplane catch ice, and then the engine start to broke. He make the other two people open the door, throw the money out. So I always think some poor village here, everybody, no money, everybody like this, and then out of the sky come all this money. This is true, they have to throw all the money out. So this happened many times. They throw gold out the window because the airplane is going to crash. The airplane is more valuable than the gold inside the airplane.
Along with fatigue and tension, these crew members had to suffer the shadow of death all the time. Each 1,000 tons of cargo flown to China cost 3 pilots' lives. The airmen had a slogan: a drop of gasoline, a drop of blood.
One time I was away on a mission in Chongqing around, and when I got to Kunming, they said we lost 20 planes last night. One night.
The Hump route was like a devil, devouring the crews one after another. Pilots were dragged and crashed on the route one by one. In 6 months, the China National Aviation Corporation suffered such heavy losses that it became seriously short of aircrew. The GM sent a telegram to the China Aviation Committee asking for help. Getting cargo over the Hump was so crucial that pilots were transferred from the Air Force to the China National Aviation Corporation to fly its transport planes. Long Chi-ming was one of them. He was a radio operator on a C-47 transport aircraft.
那些年轻人不懂事儿，反正是飞就飞嘛，窗死就算了，这么一个观念，没有想很多啊。有些朋友早晨很几个都是早晨一起喝茶、喝咖啡嘛，10杯钱，一走哦，那个走了，走了就走了。
Although the young pilots flew with passion and courage, initially only small amounts of supplies got through. Chennault and his China Air Task Force were experiencing the most difficult period. Every mission had to wait for days, impatiently accumulating supplies coming over the Hump route. In Chennault's words, "We had to fight, scream and scrape for every man, plane, spark plug, and gallon of gas." The China Air Task Force consisted of a fighter group and a bomber squadron. The commander of the fighter group was the legendary Colonel Robert Lee Scott Jr. He successfully led his force for the first 6 months before being transferred back to the States. In that time, Scott shot down 13 Japanese aircraft. After returning to the U.S., he published his memoirs. Entitled "God is My Co-Pilot," they revealed his experience fighting in China. His book was later adapted into a movie by Warner Brothers and staged around the world. The fighter group's commander center was located in Guilin. It had less than 80 aircraft. Chennault used such a negligible power to fight the Japanese on an almost 5,000 miles front, from central and southern China to Burma and Vietnam. He constantly shifted his small force from one airfield to another on unoccupied Chinese territory, playing hide and seek with the Japanese.
他们的飞机啊，为了怕日本知道他们到底有多少架飞机，所以他们经常在把飞机经常改号码，啊，尾巴尾翼号码改一改，什么东西改一改。然后他们基地很多，我今天在东部作战，明天我就跑到南部去作战，日本人反而变得更被动。
Owing to the scarcity of aviation fuel, munitions, and other materials, in August 1942, Chennault was forced to lower the mission frequency of the China Air Task Force. By the end of September, the China Air Task Force had only 38 pilots and 34 aircraft left. The fuel reserve could only last for 2 days. It was forced to lie low and become dormant. Chennault was anxious that while the China Air Task Force was not defeated in combat, it was jeopardized by the lack of materials. The two governments invested tremendous effort in order to improve traffic loads. The United States transferred more aircraft and pilots to the Hump operation. Controversially, pilots were ordered to fly regardless of the weather conditions. After that, no matter how bad the weather was, no matter how many Japanese fighters were on the way, between 100 and 500 transport planes flew over the Hump around the clock.
It was very, very tiring. When you completed a round trip, when you landed back at Moenbury, you had felt like you'd done a real day's work. It was very fatiguing, especially when the weather was real bad. It was a real challenge physically to fly the airplane through these storms.
But since we had not been allowed to use weather as a reason for not flying, I think there was a general who decided that there was no weather that was too bad to fly in, so we flew.
We fly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather.
As the main terminus of the Hump route, Kunming Airfield earned the reputation as the world's busiest airport. With an average of 1 aircraft per minute taking off or landing, supply levels were restored. Once they were resupplied, Chennault's task force again went on the offensive. Ever since they captured Hong Kong, it was an important transport hub for the Japanese. Hong Kong was not only a maintenance and supply center of the Japanese Navy, but also an important transit base for the Air Force and departure port for naval escorts. In October 1942, the U.S. and Japanese forces were engaged in an intense battle around Guadalcanal Island in the South Pacific. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater. Both sides threw more and more forces for the battle. The Japanese gathered their forces in Hong Kong. It was a key staging post for the Guadalcanal battle. And it was a target Chennault couldn't resist. He'd bombed the Japanese fleet in the harbor and the port facilities. Chennault's planning officer for the raid was Marion Cooper. He's more famous for guiding another large operation. Cooper directed the first King Kong movie. The first step was to secretly transfer all available aircraft to airfields that could reach Hong Kong. The aircraft moved in small groups so as to not arouse Japanese suspicions. At dawn, October 25th, 12 B-25 bombers escorted by 7 P-40 fighters took off to bomb Hong Kong. This attack was a complete surprise. The Japanese forces only discovered there were American planes overhead when the bombs started falling on their heads. Within seconds, high explosive bombs fell onto the harbor, destroying docks, warehouses, oil tanks, and vessels. After the mission, while the U.S. planes were flying back to base, the escort fighters spotted Japanese interceptors seeking revenge for the attack. They dived down towards them. In the intense dogfights, the U.S. fighters got 11 Japanese planes. The B-25s also shot down 7 Japanese fighters, while losing just 1 plane of their own. The Hong Kong assault was the most successful operation since the establishment of the China Air Task Force. Chennault awarded medals to the participants in this mission. A month later, Chennault planned the raid on Canton. In addition to the successful bombing of the port, the U.S. Air Force also scored a brilliant 27-0 victory in dogfights. However, frequent missions used up Chennault's last bit of reserves. With equipment and supplies exhausted, the Air Force again went dormant. Everything depended on new supplies coming over the Hump. The Hump route is not only one of the most dangerous routes in the world, but also the longest, largest, and most costly wartime airlift operation during World War II.
The Hump was a technical feat of great accomplishment. You know, it was like the Berlin airlift of 1947-48. You know, it accomplished a technical miracle of air transport.
For every ton of bombs Chennault threw at the Japanese, the transport group had to ship 18 tons of supplies to China. And this does not include the aircraft and crews devoured daily by this death route. On March 11th, 1943, 24-year-old American pilot Jim Fox, Chinese co-pilot Tan Xuan, and radio operator Wang Guoliang flew a fully loaded plane from Kunming to Assam. Behind it was the number 48 aircraft of the China National Aviation Corporation. Pete Gautier was the captain. The weather was great. Gautier was in a good mood. He used his handheld camera to film the number 53 aircraft. He never expected that this would become its final images.
Kunming! 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 Do you...
2 minutes later, Gautier witnessed the number 53 aircraft. previously flying like a beautiful bird, suddenly drop out of the sky like a boulder. Gautier circled around where the number 53 aircraft crashed, hoping to see survivors coming out of the wreckage. However, except for some of the debris in the dense forests, he could not see anything. The crash of aircraft number 53 was the only one which was witnessed by other pilots and whose precise position was known. However, it fell into Japanese-occupied territory, which made a ground search impossible. The position was reported to all the Hump pilots. Thereafter, whenever conditions allowed, they would try to fly near the crash site, hoping to see a miracle. However, they never saw anything. After the crash of the number 53 aircraft, the story was widely spread. Another Hump pilot, Fletcher Hanks, wouldn't believe that Fox died in that canyon. He was determined to find his comrades. A year later, the Japanese were forced to withdraw, and the crash site was reclaimed by China. Hanks organized a search team to go to the crash site. Among them was Stephen Cusack.
They're young people, 23, 24. They don't know. They've never been in mountains. Two of them separate to go look for the airplane. And they use a stick to choose. So my father go with Red Holmes to look for the airplane, and my father get very sick. He almost died.
The team searched in the forest for 9 days. They were forced to quit when food ran out and the team members got ill.
My father always tells me this story many times. He says he never ever in his whole life felt so bad.
Later on, Hanks found out that the search team were just 1 mile from the crash site. After returning home, he was haunted by the idea of looking for Fox in the Galingong Mountains. He vowed he would return one day. He didn't know that it would be another 50 years to find the crash site. In 1996, local hunters found the plane wreckage on a ridge over 3,400 meters above sea level.
我们到那个点的时候，像它的那个飞机的翅膀啊，右翅膀上插着一根铁杉树，左翅膀是那个它摔下来的时候那个拍在地下的石头上，所以它左翅膀它就有明显的断的这个痕迹，里边的那些都比较完整，还有包括它的那个垒滩啊，垒滩都还有气。
It was confirmed to be aircraft number 53. It was the best preserved aircraft among the hundreds of planes that crashed on the Hump. Unfortunately, even after several searches, no remains of the crew were ever found. The fate of Fox and his 2 Chinese crew members remains a mystery. After the discovery of the wreckage of aircraft number 53, the Chinese people faithfully guarded it for almost 2 years. In 1997, Hanks heard the news that the wreckage of the number 53 aircraft was found. He immediately flew to China. Coming to China again, Hanks was already 80 years old. but insisted on getting through the deep forests and coming to the crash site.
那到了这个上面这个这架飞机上，一到他就一看他就看出来这架飞机是他战友的，他是非常熟悉的，哭了，他在那个地方跪起哭，摸起哭，话也讲不着了，他一直在哭啊，掉眼泪啊。
In 1998, the county government moved the wreckage down from the ridge to the nearest town. Chinese soldiers and civilians held a solemn ceremony to greet this plane which had lain in the mountains for over 50 years. They even built a memorial museum for it. Outside the museum, there are 3 stones memorializing the crew members. The restored aircraft was parked inside. Its huge fuselage murmurs about those days of tragedy and glory. In the 3.5 years of its operation, China and the U.S. invested over 2,700 aircraft and transported more than 800,000 tons of supplies and equipment on the Hump route. Over 80% of military supplies on the Chinese battlefield were provided by the Hump airlift operation. It successfully enabled China to continue fighting the Japanese and to hold its position on the battlefield. Almost 1 plane per day. Over 1,500 planes in total crashed to keep this vital route open. More than 1,700 crew members were killed or missing. From late 1942 to early 1943, Chennault was in Kunming, frustrated. Sometimes war is more of a mathematical problem. Chennault knew he would need many more planes, pilots, and war materials to win this war. He believed that the era of aerial guerrilla war was coming to an end, and he already had plans to launch an ambitious strategic offensive against the Japanese.
他说他的构想是有3个，第一个是说他只要有1万吨的驼峰物资1个月，他就可以完成这3个构想。第一个，他要把日本在中国的空中武力全部消灭掉；第二个，他要把在中国沿海的日本海上补给线全部打掉；最后一个是对日本本土实施轰炸。他认为只要这3点办到了，日本就会投降。
Generalissimo and Madame Chiang enthusiastically embraced his plan. However, it was rejected by Chennault's superior, U.S. General Stilwell, the commander of the China-Burma-India Theater.
他掌握着这个驼峰空运的分配权。那史迪威是认为说是空军只是一个协助陆军的一个作战单位，啊，真正说你想要赢场这场战争呢，攻下这个基地呢，必须靠刺刀，必须靠步兵，靠刺刀把才能攻上下来。
一定程度上是因为陈纳德将军的观念太先进了，从空中打赢战争，这样的观念太先，反而是史迪威这样一位美国老派的军人所没有办法去想象，跟没有办法去接受的。
It took personal letters from Chiang Kai-shek and Chennault to U.S. President Roosevelt to break the impasse. The brilliant victories of Chennault's Flying Tigers had won him some currency in the U.S. His aerial strategy also deeply attracted President Roosevelt. Since the vision of a ground counter-offensive into Burma was not clear, Roosevelt decided to give priority to launch an air offensive in China. He believed it would simultaneously stimulate the morale of the Chinese people and effectively weaken the Japanese. Thus, the establishment of an independent Air Force under Chennault's command was on the agenda. However, Roosevelt's senior military advisors, including General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, vigorously disagreed.
Of course, as every strategist in their right mind recognized, this was ridiculous. It took 3 years of total war by the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, ultimately 2 atomic bombs, the Soviet entry into the war against Japan to get Japan to surrender, right? The notion that 500 planes was going to change the course of the war was, of course, ridiculous, but it was wonderfully appealing. This was low human cost in terms of American lives. Compare that to the, going into Iwo Jima or going into Okinawa, thousands of people were killed. I mean, this seemed like almost a sanitary way. And again, this was the era of fascination with bombing, the idea that bombing could bring any enemy to its knees. And so I think Chennault appealed to that streak in the American imagination.
A Chinese lady's visit to the States provided the last push for Chennault's aerial strategy. In February 1943, Madame Chang came to the United States in the name of seeing doctors. Her real mission was to get as much aid as possible. This elegant China First Lady created a big sensation throughout the United States. She was a perfect combination of the Oriental classics and the Western elegance in a sharp, astute style. The Americans were completely overwhelmed.
That all men are created equal.
On February 18th, Madame Chang made a speech to the joint session of the U.S. Senate and Congress. Her speech was often interrupted by applause.
I can also assure you that China is eager and ready to cooperate with you and other peoples to lay a true and lasting foundation for a sane and progressive world society which would make it impossible for any arrogant or predatory neighbor to plunge future generations into another orgy of blood.
The speech drew rapturous applause. Millions of Americans listened to the speech on radio. Her Southern accent and her affectionate, righteous words won them over. The very next issue of the influential Time magazine had her on its cover. Madame Chang's speech had immediate effect. A day later, President Roosevelt announced that U.S. assistance to China would be increased. A few days later, Roosevelt promised Chiang Kai-shek that he'd send 500 airplanes as soon as possible. Chennault was close to achieving his goal. On March 3rd, Chennault was promoted to Major General. A week later, a new unit, the U.S. 14th Air Force, was formally established. Chennault was its commander. He finally realized his dream of commanding an Air Force. (1943) was the turning point of World War II. In Europe, the Soviet Union won a great victory in the Battle of Stalingrad and started a full-scale counterattack on the Germans. With Italy's surrender, the battle in North Africa came to an end. The combined US, British, and Canadian troops prepared to open a second front through the biggest invasion in history. In the Pacific, the Japanese lost heavily in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and with that, Japan lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Working in concert, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine forces were gaining the upper hand against the Japanese in the South Pacific. Desperate to reinforce its troops in the Pacific, Japan needed to get free from the Chinese quagmire. It needed to land a knockout blow against China. Therefore, the Japanese headquarters made the growing American air forces in China their top priority target. In March 1943, the Japanese Imperial Air Command deployed 2 additional fighter groups and 2 bomber groups to China. Their goal was to knock out the fledgling 14th Air Force. Chennault's 14th Air Force was composed of a fighter group and just 2 bomber squadrons. It was the smallest air group the United States established during the war, with less than 100 aircraft at the beginning. But it had an important feature. It inherited the fighting style and fighting spirit of the American Volunteer Group. They still painted their planes with wide-open shark mouths. Their pilots were never afraid of fighting. The Chinese people still affectionately call them the Flying Tigers. The priorities of the Japanese Air Force Spring Offensive were the 14th Air Force's main air bases. They even threw down the challenge letters over Lingling Airfield, calling it an air duel. The Flying Tigers were outnumbered. Chennault had to fight a 2-front war, so he didn't take the challenge. On one hand, the reinforcements from the United States to the 14th Air Force were not yet in place, nor were its materials and supplies. On the other hand, he did not want the Japanese to find out his disadvantage in numbers. Chennault had his plan. He was going to use the resources in hand to consume the Japanese Air Force, bit by bit. On April 28th, the Japanese aircraft attacked Kunming Airport. The U.S. fighters scored an 11-0 victory. One of the most famed pilots, Captain John F. Hampshire, the sharpshooter in the air, shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. Added to his previous successes, he had shot down 15 Japanese aircraft, becoming one of the top aces in the CBI theater. 4 days later, a battle over Lingling Airfield took place. The 14th Air Force sent 16 fighters to fight against 47 Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Hampshire shot down another 2 Japanese aircraft. After the fight, the U.S. aircraft came back to the airport. It was only then that the squadron commander, Allison, realized that Hampshire did not come back. Soon enough, the Chinese ground forces sent a telegram saying a P-40 crashed in the Shangjiang River, and the pilot was seriously injured. The news came as the victorious U.S. pilots were celebrating their victory. A few minutes later, the news got worse. The shocked pilots learned that Hampshire died. Hampshire's death deeply saddened Chennault. But he knew that without blood, there could be no victory. An ambitious air offensive battle plan was brewing in his mind. If a knockout blow is needed, he'd give them one. and wipe them from China's sky. In April 1943, 2 American generals traveled from China to Washington. They had the same goal, to drive Japan out of China. But very different agendas. General Claire Chennault wanted more planes. General Joseph Stilwell wanted equipment for the infantry. Only one man could decide what to do: U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt.
He invited both Chennault and Stilwell to come to the White House, the only time he saw both of them together. And he asked Stilwell, what did he think of Chiang Kai-shek? And Stilwell said, he's an ignorant peasant bastard who never keeps his word and who's worthless as an ally. And a few hours later, he asked Chennault, what do you think of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek? And Chennault said, he's one of the greatest leaders in the 20th century, whom we should back without hesitation. And after that, it was a no-brainer. As George Marshall said, Chennault wanted what Chiang wanted. Roosevelt wanted what Chiang wanted. It was a no-brainer to give aid to Chennault. Did it make any military sense? Of course not. Did it make political sense? Absolutely.
Chennault, formerly the commander of the American Volunteer Group, now had bigger fish to fry. The time for defense was over. As commander of the 14th Air Force, he could at last go on the offensive. Allied air bases became launch pads for attacks against the Japanese in central China. Picturesque Guilin roared with the arrival of the American Air Force. A karst cave near Yangtang Airfield, once Chennault's own headquarters, became the HQ for the American Air Force in China. The fate of China hung in the balance. Whoever controlled the air would win the war. Driving the Americans from the sky was Japan's top priority. From July 1943, the numerically superior Japanese Air Force carried out a series of large-scale attacks. A desperate fight for the air supremacy of China took place in the sky of central China. During the combats, the ratio of American planes to Japanese planes was usually 1-3, sometimes even 1-5. The fight was unprecedentedly fierce, lasting for 8 days and 8 nights. 62 Japanese fighters were confirmed as shot down, with another 46 probables, with the loss of just 3 American pilots and 6 planes. Even when an American plane was shot down, there was a good chance that the pilot would survive. American pilots wore blood chits on their backs. Written in Chinese, they informed the readers that the pilot was a friend of China. Posters were put up both in nationalist-held areas and were secretly circulated in Japanese-occupied areas. Huge rewards were offered to those who helped an American airman get back to base. Trained pilots were more valuable than planes. Rescuing a flyer from a Japanese-occupied area carried a reward of $100,000 US, around $2 million in today's currency. Even expenses incurred escorting the American pilots back were reimbursed by the Chinese government.
We're always told that if we as Americans were shot down and rescued, anything we told whoever rescued us, remember, because the government would back us up.
Few Chinese knew about such an astronomical reward, But they did know that these foreigners falling from sky were fighting for China, so of course, they should help them. John R. Allison was one of the American pilots who benefited from Chinese care. Allison was the most skilled of all Chennault's pilots. He had an amazing record and amazing luck. On one occasion, Allison commanded a fighter escort covering a bomber mission to Yichang. They were met by 20 Japanese defenders. The odds were not good. Allison had only 9 fighters. Undaunted, the Americans were swift to attack. Allison's P-40 dashed into the Japanese formation. He immediately shot down 2 enemy aircraft. A Japanese fighter attempted to attack the B-24 fleet. Allison bravely engaged in battle for a 3rd time. As he climbed toward the enemy, his rudder was destroyed by gunfire. Unable to turn, he could only fly in a straight line. A Japanese fighter got on his tail. He was in grave danger. Luckily, a Chinese pilot came to his rescue. Allison escaped and nursed his damaged plane back to base. It wasn't his only narrow escape. On a hot summer night in South China, 3 Japanese bombers attacked Hengyang. Allison and another pilot attempted to cut them off. They had only bush radar and moonlight to guide them to the enemy planes. Allison climbed and intercepted the Japanese bombers before they could drop their bombs. First, he attacked the Japanese bomber on the left. It was damaged and fled. Then Allison turned to the second bomber that was hitting him. He blew it up and became the first American pilot to shoot down a Japanese plane at night over China. However, Allison's plane was also damaged. He didn't give up, but kept fighting. He locked on to a 3rd bomber and destroyed it. It took just 1 minute to shoot down the 3 enemy planes. Allison kept flying, but was unable to make it back to base. He had to make a forced landing. He made a soft landing on the Shanjiang River. As the dazed pilot struggled toward the riverbank, a Chinese boy on a log raft fished him out of the water and took him to safety. Once again, Allison survived. In a final twist of fate, 20 years later, Allison was introduced to a young employee of his company. The man was named Ching. They had met before. Ching was the boy who pulled Allison from the river. In the fall of 1943, the Air Force in China was again reorganized. A new crew, the CACW, the Chinese American Composite Wing, was a direct descendant of the American Volunteer Group. Now, for the first time, Chinese and American pilots would fly together in a single unit. The first batch of Chinese cadets arrived at Thunderbird Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona, back in March 1942.
我们是初级班、中级班、高级班的话呢，一共大概是8个月，8个月，以后呢有3个月的部队训练，3个部队训练，这是所谓这个部队训练的话呢，这是实战作业， 就是真正的我们这个开始就是驾驶这个所谓这个鲨鱼式的那个飞机。
The Chinese-American Composite Wing, a division of the U.S. 14th Air Force, became operational on October 1st, 1943. The majority of its members were Chinese pilots trained in the United States. Only a quarter of the CACW were Americans. The unit had a joint command structure.
我们大队长，他有大队长；我们中队长，他有中队长；他有分队长，我们也有分队长。这样都是一起的，在一起混合，一起出任务，一起回来。
The commander of the CACW was Colonel Winslow Morris from the USA, and deputy commander was Zhang Weifu from the ROC. Together, the officers from both sides coordinated every mission. Although the CACW was officially part of China's Air Force, it was under the command of General Chennault's U.S. 14th Air Force.
我跟一个美国人到汉口打，打完火车站以后啊，就回来了。回来以后呢，都是有人在云里飞，你飞机这个。那时候战斗机啊，设备不是说很好的了，在云里飞呀，就是看那个小飞机啊，就在这儿飞呀。那个我们来在云里飞，飞来飞去啊，找不到机场，找不着，飞来飞去，飞到最后呢，两个人不约而同的，我没通知他，他也没通知我，我们就跳伞了，没油了吗？跳伞了以后，结果当地老百姓啊，以为是我们天兵天将的，他说他没这个知识啊，他以为是天兵天将来了，哎，所以呢，当地老百姓抬着花杆送我下山，那个山很窄，山坡滑的，铁冰的，一滑的，掉了山涧就完了就，所以呢。那个真是怪，真是。
103-year-old Xuan Yanli joined China's Air Force in 1932. After training in the U.S., he was made leader of the 1st Bomber Group of the Combined Wing and took part in one of its most famous actions.
我们炸神就是14架飞机，15架飞机掩护，15架驱逐机掩护。因为日本人这个行政，他这个主要这在台湾这基地。
The attack on Hsinchu Air Base was a brave but risky action by the 14th Air Force. On November 25, 1943, the Americans' traditional Thanksgiving Day, 30 U.S. aircraft took off from the secret airfield in Jiangxi. The Japanese were shocked when the planes appeared in formation above their airbase. They couldn't believe that there were American planes soaring overhead. More than 70 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground, and 12 were shot down in the air. All the American planes returned home safely. Tex Hill, commander of the 23rd Fighter Group, was in charge of this almost perfect battle, flying his new P-51. Hill downed a Japanese aircraft, becoming the first P-51 Mustang pilot to destroy a Japanese plane in the China theater. Although Japan started the year with more planes than the Americans, the tide had changed. With each battle, the Americans grew stronger and the Japanese weaker. As Takushiro Hattori, head of the operations section of the Army General Staff, later wrote, before 1942, we had the supremacy in the air with an absolute advantage. But then it became the complete opposite. The shock of the successful long-range attack on Hsinchu worried the Japanese High Command. They worried that if the Americans could reach Taiwan, they would soon be able to reach their homeland. In January 1944, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters launched Operation Ichigo. If successful, it would change the course of the war. It was the largest Japanese ground offensive in the war. The goal was to knock out Chinese and American air bases in China. The Japanese made a huge deployment. Its 5th Air Army in China also joined the battle, but its effectiveness was compromised. By this time, it could only put 84 fighters in the air. That was less than the number of planes the AVG had back in 1941. Yet now they faced both the 14th U.S. and Chinese Air Forces. From April through November, the Japanese won a string of victories on the ground, forcing the Nationalist Army to retreat. The Japanese Army successfully captured a string of Allied air bases, forcing the flyers to retreat. To stop them falling into enemy hands, the Americans destroyed their runways, barracks, and other facilities as they withdrew. They buried explosives beneath the runways and blew giant craters in them, and they destroyed everything that could not be taken away. In 1944, Richard Hill was assigned to China on a mission to organize and operate a secret escape network for Allied pilots whose airplanes were shot down behind enemy lines. With the help of Chinese people, Hill had saved 46 Allied pilots over 3 months. Glen Benita was one of them. Zhouzhe Town in Hubei province was once the capital of the ancient Rongcheng state. During the Second Revolutionary Civil War, it was the red capital of Western Hunan and Western Hubei Revolutionary Base area. In May 1944, Glen Benita was flying a fighter escort on a bombing mission. Benita was forced to bail out when his plane was hit by enemy fire. 90-year-old Luo Zhishi picks up the tale.
我们就跟他说了，我们也不管他懂不懂是吧？你不要怕，绝对不能伤害你，是吧？他不懂的，你说他了，他能懂的是吧？我们都是摆手的，你不要怕，不要怕。我把火烧熟的，叫他去啊，他不肯去了，不去我还是去的，拿筷子他拿不好，我们告他摆的筷子，我们说我们先去，怕他说我们有头是吧？我们先去，他那个搞好，他说。把他的东西一收出来，是吧？他说我去一个叉子，一个抓钩，像那个我们的用的抓钩是吧？
Benita was shot down so far from his base that the villagers couldn't get him there on their own. Instead, they took him to the new 4th Army. For 60 days, Benita was looked after by the new 4th Army. When he regained his strength, they escorted him back to the U.S. base. Benita carried with him a gift for General Chennault. Li Shenyan, commander of the 5th Division, had him deliver a captured Japanese sword. In 2005, Benita came back to the county with his wife and children. In Lojachun village, he reunited with the local villagers who saved his life over half a century ago. In 2010, 86-year-old Benita came back to China for the last time. Shortly after the visit, he passed away. To fulfill his final wish, his ashes were buried in China. For many Chinese people, flying tigers are heroes. But in the eyes of Benita, the Chinese people were true heroes. As he said, it's Chinese people who gave him life. Not every pilot was as lucky as Benita. On August 31st, 1944, a B-24 bomber pilot took off to bomb the Japanese battleships anchored in a port in Taiwan. On his return, his own base was itself under attack, so he was forced to divert to another airfield. He never made it. In 1996, villagers Pan Qibin and Jiang Jun went to pick herbs. They found much, much more. Near the peak of Mao'er Mountain, they found debris from a crashed plane. It was the first time it was seen in 50 years. The county museum investigated the crash site 3 times. The team found machine guns, pistols, an oxygen tank, electronic instruments, and the identification tags of 5 airmen. They confirmed that it was the plane lost over 50 years ago. The investigators speculated that flying over unfamiliar terrain in darkness and thick fog made the bomber lose direction and slam into the main peak of the mountain. Following the discovery, the Xing'an County Museum has made several trips to the mountain in attempts to locate the aviators' bodies. The terrain was so dangerous that every trip is itself life-threatening.
有些我们下去的时候，有些要搞个绳子载着下去，有些在悬崖上面，这里长了一棵大树，树枝在这个悬崖上面，我们要抓到那个悬崖，然后一个脚踩在这个树枝下面，然后从树再下去，是这样的，因为不是很危险的，很危险的啊！我们没有当时也没有想发财，也没有想什么新冠，就是想到，哎呀，这外国人帮助我们中国人抗日，牺牲在这里这么多年都不知道，大家都不知道他，现在我们发现了，我们也就是当地老百姓很不惜那些姚民啊，我们也是有义务要把他们清理出来，把他们送回去给他们。
1997 witnessed a handover ceremony of the aircrew's remains held by China and the U.S. in Xing'an County. After more than 50 years in the mountain wilderness, these American soldiers who traveled thousands of miles to help China fight the Japanese were at last reunited with their families. The oldest among them was 29 years old, the youngest 19. Success on the ground meant that the Japanese held several vital airfields. They thought that this would turn the tide in China's sky back to their favor. They were wrong. Despite their retreat from the airfields, the 14th Air Force never reduced its attacks on the enemy.
见什么打什么，看见日本运输车呀、运兵呀，我们就下去打，把那个 那个卡车都打烧了，船照打，它也都是运补的嘛，我们也把它打烧了。
Tens of thousands of Chinese flattened their farmlands and built airfields day and night. Some of the airfields were established very close to the Japanese-held territory. The Japanese destroyed these airfields whenever they found them. However, as soon as the Japanese army left, the Chinese people immediately repaired the damaged airfields. Only a few days later, the U.S. airplanes could again take off from these airfields that the Japanese thought were destroyed. It's fair to say that the U.S. planes take off from and land on the hands of the Chinese people. After the war, Chennault wrote with gratitude in his autobiography that the biggest contribution of the Chinese to the 14th Air Force was airfield construction. No matter how many airfields were occupied by the Japanese forces, they could still conduct the missions. It seemed that the Chinese could rapidly build airfields everywhere. Therefore, the 14th Air Force was like Hydra. Whenever one airfield was destroyed by the Japanese, another two would be born. Chennault was not content with sporadic bombing. At the end of 1944, he and the 20th Air Force Commander General Curtis LeMay planned an unprecedented air raid. The 20th Air Force was created in order to bomb the Japanese home islands from China. Beginning in April 1944, over 100 of the Americans' most powerful planes, B-29 Superfortress bombers, were stationed in China. At that time, the B-29 was the most advanced bomber in the world, with extraordinary flight range, bomb load, and a self-defense capability that enabled it to carry out missions without escort. On December 18th, 17 B-29s took off from Chengdu. They were headed for Hankou Airfield, Japan's biggest base in central China. Before Japanese fighters could take off, bombs rained on the targeted airfields, docks, and warehouses. When the last B-29 left, Hankou was shrouded by dense smoke. An hour later, 200 planes of the 14th Air Force took off from different airfields for the second wave of attack. The fighters had dogfights with the Japanese, who were still reeling from the previous raid. It was the biggest air raid in China. Oil stocks and barracks were destroyed. The fires at Hankou wharves burned for 8 days and railways were paralyzed. With complete mastery of the sky, the U.S. Air Force downed or damaged the 64 Japanese planes without any loss of their own. The next day, Chennault told journalists that this successful air raid showed that the Japanese had completely lost control of the air over China, and that the American and Chinese air forces now dominated China's sky. (1944) was the 7th year Chennault had been in China. He was already 54 years old. Under his leadership, Apache mercenary contingent, somewhat like Robin Hood in medieval England, had developed into a regular Air Force unit on a large scale with extraordinary combat records. While Chennault was devising new ways to fight the Japanese, the unexpected happened. A 19-year-old Chinese graduate came into his life.
The first time I met, it was in a press conference with many other reporters. I was the only woman, and but I was a little bit nervous. I mean, naturally, but I think he sort of put everybody at ease, and then he saw me and he said, you know, he knew my father. My father was the Chinese Consul General in California. So even for the first time, I was impressed by his, should I say, determination. I mean, I think any woman would love a strong man with decision, and I think that's the character, that's the impressions I have about him.
At that time, Anna Chen Xiangmei was a reporter working for the Kunming branch of the Central News Agency. For a 19-year-old girl, it can be a small step from hero worship to the start of a love affair. In the beginning, Chennault treated Anna as an elder. But as they got to know each other better, his feelings for the active and clever Chinese woman changed. Before long, his men discovered that whenever this Chinese reporter was around, a smile always hovered round their grave commander's lips.
It was not that easy for meeting each other all the time, but I didn't think about it at that time. I was very young, and I was just out from college and just doing my job. And at that time, I knew he was a married man, and well, later on, before he departed from China to the States, he told me he was going to get a divorce, and so he seemed to be very determined. Once he made up his mind what to do, just go for it, go for it.
But before this controversial love affair could bear fruit, Chennault had a mission to accomplish. By early 1945, the 14th Air Force controlled China's sky. It had grown to over 500 fighters, over 100 bombers, and over 30,000 personnel, not including the B-29s on the advanced bases and the planes of Chinese Air Force. They completely outstripped the Japanese Air Force in terms of quantity and quality. For Japan, the writing was on the wall. Chinese people were responsible for logistic service for the numerous American soldiers fighting in China. They cooked, washed clothes, cleaned houses, repaired airfields, transported ammunition, and constructed buildings. Providing food for the Americans was a big challenge for a population who were themselves suffering from extreme scarcity. It was said that Americans ate more meat in a single meal than a Chinese family ate in a year. And every American would eat 2 or 3 eggs every morning.
你提供给美国人的物资要比提供给普通的中国部队，要多丰富多了啊！它主要是有很多牛肉啊、猪肉啊、鸡蛋啊这些给云南的政府，老百姓压力很大。但是云南人都毫无怨言，去提供给他们。
Although Yunnan Province and Sichuan Province were rear areas during the war, People there made enormous contributions and sacrifice as well. In their mind, those Americans who came all the way to help them fight the Japanese were real heroes. In 2005, some of the last surviving Flying Tigers attended a reunion in China. A Chinese veteran told a harrowing story.
He said, I saw the Flying Tiger was shooting down, and I found him. I put them under the tunnel when the Japanese was searching for him. But in the tunnel, there is a lady with a small baby and kept crying. You know, if the crying, and Japanese may find it. So the lady, in order to save the life of Flying Tiger, and she tightly covered the baby's mouth. And until then, when the Japanese left, and she found out her baby died. When this happened, when they talk about this, you know, everybody feels heartbroken. And the American Flying Tigers all stood up, salute to the veteran, and Chinese veterans still salute back. They hold each other. I saw they were held tightly with the tears in the eyes.
Chinese support came in many ways. Chennault once received a letter containing a map and 20,000 Chinese cash. The sender wanted the money handed to the first pilot to bomb the Japanese occupying his hometown. His letter said, "You may drop bombs on my house, but be careful. Do not hurt my neighbors. Please take your operations during the Spring Festival, because I do not want the Japs to enjoy the festival." Chennault's men did not let that refugee down. The air raid was followed by more frequent bombing operations. With Japanese planes largely swept from China's skies, the fighters of the 14th Air Force were increasingly used in ground operations. Destruction of rail lines hindered Japanese troop movements, and movements on the Yangtze River were almost paralyzed.
We had 3 missions in China. Well, actually only 2, but one of them was support the ground troops with strafing and bombing the Japanese. The second was to harass the Japanese shipping, either from the northern Yangtze River or the South China Seas. And this was our basic role in it.
Lieutenant General Sato Yamashita, the Supreme Commander of the Japan Air Force in China, helplessly admitted that the enemy's air force was so active that they could hardly use the transport lines and were forced to march on foot. On April 14, 1944, Ho Ying-chin, Minister of Military and Chief of the General Staff of the Chinese Army, approved the West Yunnan Offensive Operation. The Chinese Expeditionary Force launched this counterattack. Tengchong was the biggest stronghold of the Japanese Army along the western bank of Nujiang River. The Nationalist Army fought fiercely to recapture the place. Chennault's 14th Air Force assisted the Army by heavily bombing the front line of the Japanese Army.
The 城中的情啊，很不好打。中国军队死了好多人，这样我们就去摧毁那个围墙，就还炸他那个堡垒，他堡垒多得不得了，一个，我们就去炸完就走，不希望带好几，一去在起码3架到5架飞机上，炸完就回来第2架呢，我去了3次。
Even with the help of the Air Force, it took 3 months and over 40 battles for the Chinese Army to recapture Tengchong. Cooperation between the Army and the Air Force enabled the Chinese to retake a string of Japanese strongholds. Thus, after 2 years of occupation, the Japanese Army was finally kicked out, and China's Southwest Gateway was at last secured. In this campaign, the Chinese Army suffered over 60,000 casualties. 14 American pilots and members of the Army Advisory Group also lost their lives. On January 27, 1945, the Chinese Expeditionary Force and the Chinese Army in India were reunited. From then on, military supplies could flow into China both by air, over the Hump, and by road. Beginning in early 1945, the coordinated counterattack by the Chinese Army and the American Air Force pushed the Japanese back. By June, there were barely any Japanese planes in China's sky. Fighting against Japanese aircraft became so rare that both American and Chinese pilots actively prayed for combat.
那时候是没有空战了，已经。我回国以后没有空战了，就是取得了这个中国战场上的制空权。是不是？这个打的没有了嘛？我们到韩国，那韩国我到韩国机场看了，2、3架飞机摆着日本飞机啊，就摆机上不敢动了。我们去了以后扫射一下，根本也就报废了已经。
By June 1945, news of the German surrender and the end of the war in Europe spread through China. The days to Japan's defeat were numbered. George Marshall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Force, Never Chennault's keenest supporters, were unwilling to let him stay in China to enjoy the fruits of victory. With the end of the war in sight, Chennault was removed from China and forced to resign.
In the summer of 1945, after Roosevelt passed away, he didn't have any champion left here in the United States. So they came in and they were, easily asked him to retire again, forced him to retire again. So again, he took another health retirement. In the summer, just weeks before the bombs were dropped and the war was over.
For a veteran, nothing was more heartbreaking than leaving the battlefield on the eve of the victory. On July 16th, the Central Daily News ran an editorial titled, "Farewell to General Chennault." There was no parallel in history for a nationalist government newspaper to run an editorial specifically for a foreigner leaving China. On July 30th, Chiang Kai-shek held an investiture for Chennault in his official mansion in Chongqing. China's highest military honor, the Order of Blue Sky and White Sun, was awarded to General Claire Chennault by the Commander-in-Chief of the Chinese theater himself, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. August 8th was an important day. Japan was already reeling from the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan, and Claire Chennault departed Kunming for his homeland. He took off from the former Kunming airfield, site of some of the Flying Tiger's earliest victories. Recently, it had been rechristened Chennault Airfield. On August 11th, 2 days after the Nagasaki bomb, the 14th Air Force stopped all combat missions. Technically, the war in the air stopped before the official Japanese surrender. Yet the order to stop air operations came not from General Chennault, who had worked tirelessly for China since 1937, but from General George Stratemeyer, the newly installed Supreme Commander of the U.S. Air Force in China. Chennault heard the news of Japan's unconditional surrender on an airplane heading for the United States via Europe.
He was not even asked to be on the Missouri when the peace treaty was signed. And what a disgrace to him, and what a hard thing for him.
The end of the war brought other changes as well. Soon, the brilliant military exploits of the Chinese-American Composite Wing would also be consigned to history. However, they had one last engagement before they disbanded. On August 21st, 1945, Takeo Imai, the Japanese Deputy Chief of Staff in China, and the representative of Yasuji Okamura, Japanese General Commander in China, flew to Zhejiang to finalize Japan's surrender. The ceremony was held in a barrack of the 5th Fighter Group of the CACW. After carefully reading the Japanese surrender memorandum prepared by the Chinese, Takeo Imai signed and sealed the memorandum. After the ceremony, Ho Ying-chin, commander of the Nationalist Army, and representatives of both China and the United States had a group photo taken. They had every reason to enjoy the moment after 8 years of bloody battles. Chennault did not stay in the U.S. for long. 6 months later, he was back in China and created his own civil aviation company. Never politically astute, he soon fell foul of the new political realities. Initially, he was engaged to transporting military supplies to Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War. Later, he was involved in the legal proceedings with the government of the People's Republic of China over 71 airplanes detained in Hong Kong. On the mainland, these events tarnished the good reputation previously built up as General of the Flying Tigers. When severe illness caused Chennault to be hospitalized in his later years, his forever princess, Madame Chang, visited him in the hospital. She still called him General, just as she had done in China since 1937. Chennault died on July 27, 1958. 9 days before his death, he was promoted to Lieutenant General by President Eisenhower. His funeral ceremony was held in the Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. Tomb of General Chennault was carved in Chinese on the back of his tombstone. It is the only tombstone with Chinese characters in Arlington National Cemetery. In 1960, a bronze statue of Chennault was erected in Taipei. Madame Chang and Chen Changmei attended the unveiling ceremony. Chennault's ties with the mainland remained fractured until long after his death. In 1981, his wife Anna visited China on a special envoy of President Reagan. Deng Xiaoping met with a delegation headed by Anna Chennault in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. During their talk, Deng Xiaoping spoke highly of General Chennault and his flying tigers. This was the first time since 1949 that a Chinese official positively acknowledged Chennault's contribution to the anti-Japanese war.
保国怀壮志，正好乘风飞去，那时候就是那种心情啊，长空万里对日本的，负我救河山，非要把日本人给打回去不行。那时候真是那种心情。
我加了空军呢，32年，30年我才想开始飞行，你想想看。30年才想开始飞行，一直到现在，我还活着，能够活着，已经很好了，我很满意。我的一生，对得起国家。
Over 2,000 American airmen lost their lives in China. Some of these young lives disappeared in China's sky. Some fell onto the ground of China. Some sank into rivers and lakes. They all had one name integrating strength and courage: the Flying Tigers.